Everybody could please take your seats. We're going to get started. After Dr. Jeff Shuren speaks, we did forget one of our regional chairs, Dr. Javier Davila, which we're going to ask him to come up and give us an update on from Mexico. But we'll do it after. We're going to do it right after Dr. Jeff Shuren. Just a few more minutes, please. I'm really excited and proud to have Dr. Shuren join us today as head of CDRH for the FDA. Jeff has done a fantastic job of having this huge tanker and moving it in the right direction where there's creation of a better balance between minimizing risk, but also not slowing down innovation from reaching patients, which has its own risk. We've tried to have Jeff join us in California for a few years. We finally had to bring the mountain to Jeff, so we're really glad we're here. So without further ado, Dr. Jeffrey Shuren, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks all of you. Appreciate the opportunity to come talk and to bring the mountain, if you will, over here. Well, I get the opportunity to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. It's establishing a national evaluation system for health technology. We put health with a small h. And we say health rather than medical devices because our interest is in technologies and information that can be gathered from technologies beyond what may be considered as traditional medical devices, and I'll talk about that. And from the FDA perspective, patient safety, and Joe alluded to this, is more than simply assuring that we don't have unsafe devices out on the market, and not just about identifying safety problems more quickly, but it is facilitating the development of safer, more effective technologies. And that's what I'll talk about and how this approach can help achieve that. So our vision for the center and for the medical device program is that patients in the U.S. have access to high-quality, safe and effective medical devices of public health importance, first in the world. This is not about a competition between countries. It's simply a recognition that we want devices to be safe, we want them to benefit patients, but if they are, they're of no value to patients unless they have timely access. And first in the world is simply a good metric for that. Now we face a challenge here in the US. We have a fabulous standard for patient safety, particularly as applies to high-risk and innovative lower-risk devices, and that is reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. Why? It's one of the highest standards, regulatory standards in the world, because for those technologies, you have to demonstrate a benefit, usually with clinical studies. Most of the rest of the world looks at safety and performance. The challenge, though, is you will then need more evidence to get that product, high-risk, innovative, lower-risk devices, on the market in the US, and that can create a disincentive for innovators to bring their technologies here first, if at all. So over the past few years, we have been focusing on trying to reduce the time and cost of devices coming to the market in the US and staying on the market, but not undermining that standard of reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. And that, to us, is the sweet spot. One of the underpinnings that we have pursued is what we call flexible regulatory paradigms. Rather than the traditional approach of you take a technology and you put it in a one-size-fits-all pathway, we are designing regulatory pathways around the technology, around what the evidentiary needs are, the innovation cycles, and patient access. And we've also been putting in place far more flexible policies on benefit and risk, not just explicitly stating the factors and how we consider those factors in assessing the benefits and risks of a technology, but the societal trade-offs about when that technology comes to market. Specifically, how much uncertainty do you accept about benefits and risks before a product enters the US marketplace, understanding that you may want to accept more uncertainty when we have a technology treating a life-threatening condition. And that may mean earlier market entry for that product. And that's a hallmark of something up here called our expedited access pathway. It's a pathway for breakthrough technologies. And the last piece here, all the way on the right, is about the science of patient input. So when you think about benefits and risks, you always have to put a value on it. The question is, whose value? And at the FDA, traditionally, it would be the preferences of the reviewer Whereas we all know technologies are used on or in patients, and therefore we'd rather be relying on the trade-offs patients want to make. But how do you assess those preferences in a scientific manner such that you can rely on them? And that's the science of patient input. And we've already been doing studies on patient preferences and starting to incorporate that into our decision making. But ultimately, the real key to success in getting product on the market, staying on the market, adoption and reimbursement is evidence. It's the science behind it. Now, there have been a number of developments over the past several years that help put us in a very different place. Of course, the information age has resulted in rapidly expanding computer power. It's estimated that in the next 30 years, the power of a single computer will exceed that of the combined brain power of the entire human race. That's startling. And secondly, we all know about increasingly more data out there. In fact, it's estimated that 90% of the world's data was just created in the past 2 years. And that creates wonderful opportunities. But unfortunately today, we deal with great inefficiencies in our healthcare system, as you well know. There's data generated every single day as a part of routine clinical practice, but we can't make good use of it because systems don't talk to one another. That data may be of poor quality, may not be complete. Different definitions are used by different data collection tools, even though we may be talking about the same kind of data points, and there are inadequate methodologies. And in addition, today, data is wrapped up in silos. We are competing around the use of data rather than freeing up that data and competing around the technologies that are developed and understood through that data. So, what does the world look like today in terms of our assessment of medical devices? Well, we rely very heavily on one-off clinical studies. A traditional clinical study is incredibly expensive to conduct, particularly here in the US. All the administrative burdens to go ahead and set that up. And it's got terrible limitations, as you well know, because often the patients who are being assessed in a study, which needs to be so pristine to tease out benefits in that smaller population, may not be truly reflective of the patients who are going to use that technology once it's out on the marketplace, meaning we don't have necessarily a great understanding of the benefit-risk profile of that device. Moreover, to truly assess and understand the full benefit-risk profile, you have to look at a lot of patients, and you can't do that prior to marketing. It would be so prohibitive, nothing would ever get on the marketplace. And when it's out there, oftentimes to identify a new problem or a greater frequency of a known risk, we rely on passive surveillance. We rely on an individual, usually a practitioner, to identify there was a problem, identify there's an association between the use of a device and that problem, and then report it to the FDA or the manufacturer. As a result, things may be missed, or a lot of patients are exposed to a device and experience an adverse event that maybe could be avoided before it's actually detected. And clinical research tends to be separate from clinical practice. And then finally, because we have so much challenges in gathering data in the post-market setting in clinical trials, because once a device is on the market, patients generally lack an incentive to enroll in clinical studies. It's very hard to find the right place in drawing the line of what evidence we need to go to market versus what we may need or be able to push off into the post-market setting. That we know we can accept more uncertainty in some cases, but it's premised on the fact that we'll resolve those uncertainties quickly after the product is approved. So where do we go? Well, this goes back to how do we better leverage that data being generated in routine clinical practice, whether it's in healthcare facilities or in the home, what we call real-world data, to then generate real-world evidence. Because we think the values here are the following. Instead of looking at passive surveillance to identify problems, going and taking advantage of larger data sets that are out there, but then applying more sophisticated analytical tools, ones that we already have developed, and start to make those associations between adverse effects and the technologies being used. If that data can be better used, then we know we can make shifts in the data we collect pre-market versus post-market because the data is already being collected. It's not about necessarily enrolling people in a new clinical trial. and moving clinical research to be embedded into the workflow of routine clinical practice. That ultimately is the big solution. So what we have put on the table is establishing this national evaluation system for health technology that is leveraging that real-world data, both to facilitate products coming to market and putting in place a safety net once those products are being used out in clinical practice. And in 2012, we had proposed this system. The idea is how we leverage data that's already there in device registries, electronic health records, patient claims forms, and incorporate within that information what we call a unique device identifier. Today, there are so many thousands of technologies on the market, and oftentimes those records may not be specific, particularly electronic health records, claims forms, on what device was actually used. So we have developed a system under which medical devices and their labeling, sometimes on the product, have to have a unique code, and now about incorporating that code into electronic health information so you can finally link the use of a device with the patient's experience with that device. And the purpose here is how we develop a better understanding of the real benefit risk profile of a technology and feed that back to providers, to patients, and to developers to more quickly identify safety problems so we can address them more quickly, to reduce burdens on the time and cost of evidence generation coming to market, not sacrificing the robustness of the data, but intelligently reducing time and costs. I'll explain why in a minute. And then ultimately facilitating then the approval or clearance of safe and effective devices. For patients, for providers, for payers, talking about better information for making the kinds of decisions that they need to make. And on the industry side, reducing the time and cost on evidence generation, reducing some of the regulatory burdens they currently face, but not sacrificing safety and effectiveness. Ultimately, we think having more robust data in the right time and in the right way to inform better decision making. And we have already been leveraging this kind of data in some of our decisions. And I'll give you some examples in just a moment. So what are the key features of NEST? What are we talking about? Well, this is essentially it. It's to drive down the time and cost and increase the value and use of real-world data to meet the needs of the medical device ecosystem stakeholders through a market-driven, collective buying power approach using a neural network model. Can everyone say that again 3 times fast? But let me walk this through, because this is much more of a market-based model. It's not a traditional approach that we have used at the FDA before. So at its heart is an independent coordinating center. One of the challenges we have today in the use of data is the marketplace for data. So to drive down the cost of a medical device when you buy it, well, physician groups band together, healthcare facilities can band together. That collective buying power drives down cost. But when we think about the time and cost and use of data, we don't necessarily have that marketplace for the data for our understanding of medical technologies. So NEST is about bringing together representatives from the ecosystem and establish that kind of buying power. Starts with an independent coordinating center who is now focused on using that buying power to then force, or if you will, encourage standardization in terms of the core data elements that are collected, data quality, use of common definitions, linkages between data sources, linking up registries and electronic health records and payer claims, the development of advanced analytics, and creating the data use agreements with data owners. We're not talking about creating a new system of data. It is about coordination, governance, and standardization in the use of data that is collected and still retained by the data holders. So that's a federated system. The oversight on it, the governance structure, is comprised of representatives of key stakeholder groups in the ecosystem. So that is its industry, its providers, its patients, its payers, its government. So FDA doesn't own the system. We don't run the system. It is of, by, and for the ecosystem. We have a seat at the table. Very different approach than we've talked about previously. And the last piece then is the business model. So we have been trying to work with the device industry, with Congress, about getting seed funding to get that coordinating center up and running and keeping it operating, and some basic funding to invest in setting up core structures. But then the ultimate use of the data comes from those who are interested in accessing the system, then paying for its use. But the cost down because of the collective buying power. And the success then on NEST is because the return on investment for going through NEST, as opposed to setting up a traditional clinical trial, is worth it. There's a greater return on investment. I mentioned the neural network model. So what are we talking about? The traditional model today is you want to do a clinical study, you may go through a coordinating center, you establish relationships with clinical trial sites, you conduct your study. Wildly expensive, lots of individual contracts, going through separate IRBs, it takes a long time. And then when over and done with, maybe you can reuse it, but still very challenging. The neural network is essentially a network of subnetworks. Relationships, in this case, between data sources that are then, if you will, activated depending upon the question that you're answering. So I'm a neurologist. This is why I think about neural networks. So much like the brain works, this is very similar. So let me give you an example. Today, the FDA has a system we call Sentinel. It is a subnetwork of owners of payer claims data that are then linked together. And the FDA, when the FDA has a question, they may pose the question to that body of data owners, and they have a coordinating center, and they do an analysis to answer that question. That's claims data. The government established PCORnet, which essentially is a subnetwork of electronic health records. It too has a coordinating center, and there are studies that can be conducted out of PCORnet. But the governance structures are very different. They have different interests. NEST is about a governance structure representing the interests of the medical device ecosystem and establishing those linkages between systems like Sentinel, PCORnet, and medical device registries, linkages that we have already been in the process of setting up. That's the neural network model, and depending upon the question you're asking or the study you want to conduct, you may be looking at leveraging registries, electronic records, a combination of the two, payer claims. Again, it depends, but you've established the linkages, you've established the relationships, you have commonalities in core data sets, definitions, and therefore the cost to use that system is dramatically less than what otherwise occurs in a traditional study. In setting up the system, we established two multi-stakeholder groups. So there was representation from key stakeholder groups I mentioned previously. One was a planning board who put out a report last year on the steps to take, additional steps to take to set up the system. They have also established the criteria for the coordinating center, and we have put out a call for nominations for a coordinating center. We have received those nominations, and we are currently vetting them. And if the funding arises for us to continue the coordinating center for a few years, the agency is in the position to provide the seed funding to get it off the ground, which we would do. The second group was a medical device registry task force that focused more specifically on unique issues with device registries, identified where there were needs for additional device registries, and talked about something called a coordinated registry network. Essentially, strategic alliances between more like-situated registries, a subnetwork, if you will. Recognizing that today, with all the data quality issues, one data source may not be fit for purpose, but a linkage between two or more may be. And therefore, in setting up the system, we don't have to have perfection. Instead, those linkages can make do for inefficiencies we currently have. You are, in effect, building the airplane while you're flying it. That's what we have been doing. In fact, we've set up these kinds of coordinated registry networks already. For example, we have the International Consortium of Orthopedic Registries. So over a dozen countries participate and now link their data together on orthopedic implants. We, as an agency, have been making investments for the past 5 years. We've set up that unique device identifier system. As of now, all high-risk devices have them. In a few weeks, Essentially all moderate risk devices will, and in the next 2 years, the low risk devices. We'll have them all either in their labeling or on the product itself. We have completed or engaged in over 50 projects already that are starting to demonstrate return on investment, creating new data sources, new analytical methods, and demonstrating the concept of use of real-world evidence more generally. And we've already invested over $30 million in getting this up and off the ground. As I mentioned, we've been using real-world data already. So the the Society of Thoracic Surgeons, the American College of Cardiology, set up the Transcatheter Valve Therapy Registry a few years ago in coordination with us, with the Medicare program, and with some of the companies who were developing transcatheter aortic valve replacement devices. And those two societies and one of the companies were about to do a clinical trial to look at alternative access modes for that device. We looked at the data in the registry and felt the answer was already there. We contacted the societies and the company and said, cease and desist. There's no reason to come to us with the clinical trial protocol. In fact, instead ask us to expand the labeling indication, and in a course of 3 weeks we did it, as opposed to spending a small fortune and over a year to go through a traditional clinical trial. We have been using registry data as a control arm in pivotal clinical trials. What does that mean? So for devices like this, instead of enrolling patients into 2 arms, you're enrolling them just into 1 arm. Again, big decrease in time and cost, not sacrificing the quality of the data that we're getting. We've been using database information to demonstrate the clinical validity of diagnostic tests. In fact, we've done that in a case of next-generation sequencing for cystic fibrosis. So again, didn't need to do a new clinical study. This data was in a database that Hopkins was maintaining. And then for post-market studies that we may require, we've had a number of companies who have been nesting the studies within a registry, and we've already been finding a reduction in cost of 40 to 60%, not to mention expediting the time we get the answers to questions. In fact, in cases where traditionally we may not even get the answer because patients wouldn't enroll in the studies, now we're getting answers to questions, and we're getting it in a timely manner. So what does the world look like as we move forward? This was the world of a few years ago, and we think about pre-market review and traditional kind of post-market surveillance. I mentioned about this pathway for breakthrough devices, these more flexible benefit-risk policies we put in place, and that has really changed the point at which there is market entry, and we think rational market entry for technologies. And we're starting to see some technologies and companies bringing their devices to the US earlier or first, which they were not doing a few years ago. But Nest is the game changer, because with that, we have the opportunity to set the needle, depending upon the kind of technology, in a very different place to allow for more faster market entry in some cases, answering those questions in a timely manner post-market, and with the kind of safety net we need in place. And that becomes a major driver for both device innovation, for safer, more effective products, and for better protection for patients once that device is on the market. And that is the future that we are building towards. So let me stop there, say thank you, and if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take a question or two. I think I have 2.5 minutes left. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. This is really exciting. A couple of questions. Is Nest out now? And the unique device ID, how does that help Nest?
Yeah. So Nest is not out now. The next step is, will we get the basic funding support to get Nest off the ground? We are in discussions with industry as a part of our user fee program, which gets reauthorized next year. This is one of the topics of discussion between us and the device industry. And this is out publicly. We put out our meeting minutes of those discussions. And we've been in discussions with members in Congress, whether Congress would provide funding. You know, I mentioned the Sentinel system for drugs. So Congress gave $25 million, and the drug industry spends about $20 million a year to support Sentinel, and that today is purely for post-market surveillance and money just to the FDA. Here we're talking about handling both sides, pre-market and post-market, in a very different model where the money goes to that independent coordinating center, and the stakeholders, folks sitting in this audience, start having much more of a say in that system. So hopefully we'll get that money, and if we do, then NEST will become a reality. I think it'll be about 18 months from that time before we have a rudimentary system. Why? Because we've already been putting in the building blocks to date. So the unique ID then helps to identify what device was used in the patient. Whereas, let's say you have claims data today. Typically the code isn't sufficiently granular, so you don't know which device by which maker and which version was used in the patient. Same in electronic health records, but the UDI identifies who made it, the version of it, so you know exactly what was used in that patient.
Abbas Shuberi, I'm the Vice Chair of OBGYN at Inova Fairfax. Thank you for coming and sharing your time with us. Very instructive. I was wondering, would the NEST change the 510K process in terms of approval of new devices, or because from my point of view, that seemed to be where a lot of errors sneak into the system, where people would come up with devices that say it's analogous to something that existed before. We don't need to have to show you the preliminary results to introduce it into the market, and then we're stuck with the complications.
That's exactly right. So under the standards to come to market, it's truly the high-risk, the innovative, lower-risk devices that have clinical trials, clinical data to demonstrate the benefits, the risks, and the benefits outweigh the risks. And then you have all these devices that kind of the Me Too's, and they come on by showing that they are technologically similar. They're substantially equivalent to another device on the market. Therefore, they piggyback on the idea if the first device is safe and effective, then they must be safe and effective. What this solves here is getting the better data, actual clinical data on those devices, but not because it's something they need to come to market, but once on the market, better understanding what they do. If there are safety problems, we can address them. If they're truly better than other technologies out there, people should know that. And there's an opportunity then to use them more wisely and then feed them back, that information back to the developers for them to make better technology.
I'm very excited by this because when we think of the vaginal mesh complication debacle that we had, it took literally 5 years and what is it, like 300,000 implants before that was caught. Having the live data to show the complications is really exciting.
Yes, if we had NEST set up, then we would have identified those issues with mesh, we think, years earlier.
In some of the previous sections, we've been talking a lot about how electronic health records and devices are working together now for early detection of certain conditions. We talked about sepsis a lot. And really what we're talking about there is clinical decision support. And so kind of the two-part question there would be, how does something like that, where you're talking about interaction within a world of devices, fit into a model like this? And also, as we're hearing, it's being implemented more and more in a lot of the hospitals that we work with. Kind of how's that on the roadmap for FDA right now?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, yes, we're increasingly seeing clinical decision support software, tools out there. While we have not put out a formal policy, a traditional regulatory model is not going to work on clinical decision support. You're not going to see those tools come to market as part of the problem because the best ones have more of a learning loop to them. They're good enough, then you learn, you're constantly iterating. You can't keep coming back in the door in a regulatory system. It just won't work. So what we care about the most is if the data points that go into such a tool are coming from a more traditional device diagnostic, then we want to make sure that information is accurate. But then the algorithm that is trying to more replicate how you'd think about the use of that information, what it means, would be something that we're not likely to actively regulate. But it's still, we still for this country don't have a solution on how we better understand what it does. And we think being able to leverage data that's otherwise collected, and to truly get to that, that will take time, that is the better answer. And that becomes both a feedback loop in terms of improving the technology and I think a better safety net on its use.
You're going to get a good workout.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. I can see how the notion of decreasing the time for pre-market clearance would help allow products to get to market faster and then potentially deal with just adoption issues. Would you envision NEST also encompassing wellness devices, though, in addition to traditional medical devices?
So the answer is yes. It's not that you decide a technology is under it, but if you already have data that's being collected on it, you leverage it. And to the extent there's value, there's return on the investment for leveraging it because it's a value to a particular stakeholder group, then you'll have the marketplace to do so. I don't foresee registries collecting for the truly low risk, but a number of them will be collected in other data sources like electronic health records. And they have a way to go before you can make widespread use of them. Registries today, though, we are already using because many of them have better curation already built into them. That's half the problems with electronic health records, not great curation. All right, thank you very much.